Hey everybody, Eric Grenier here with Philippe J. Fournier for this week's episode of The Numbers. Philippe, we're only a few days away from Parliament returning. We have a new cabinet.
That's right.
Summer's just around the corner too. We got the hockey playoffs that we're all watching, and there's lots going on. How are you feeling?
Oh, well, that game last night, huh? Oof.
Is that a game? It seemed more like an execution or something. I don't know what that was.
that was painful. And I know I'm saying this with a smile, but I'm not laughing. I'm not a Leafs fan, but I have many friends who are Leafs fans. And like, wow, that was not even close, huh? Wow, That was painful to watch. But anyway, yes, Eric, it's good to see you. It's good to keep this podcast going. We're going to talk about a bit of federal stuff, but we have also polls from the provinces, Quebec, we have Alberta, we have Ontario. So where do you want to start today?
I thought we'd start with the news politically from the last week, which was the naming of the cabinet, which was on Tuesday. Now, of course, this is not really in our wheelhouse. We don't really delve into policy too much. But it is a cabinet of 28 with Carney 29 ministers. There was another 10 secretaries of state who are sort of like these lesser cabinet ministers who don't have a ministry. Some new faces, some old faces.
Yep.
Many
new
a lot
faces.
of a lot of Ontario and some Quebec representation. I'm not sure where to go with this from our perspective. I like to think about it in terms of that regional representation and how it reflects the electoral results. Clearly, a lot of ministers from the GTA. By my count, there's 9, with another 3 that are Secretary of State. So clearly, a little bit of a thank you to the GTA for still sticking, for the most part, with the Liberals. You had Quebec having a decent amount of representation, only a couple from BC, same amount as Nova Scotia, 1 each from some of the western provinces. First off, just any sort of reaction you had to those numbers.
Yeah, well, I'm glad you mentioned it, Eric, because this is not our beat. If people want to have hot takes on cabinet picks, this is the wrong podcast. Eric and I, we talk about the numbers, the polls, the projections. I find it interesting to follow, but I don't think my opinion adds to the landscape very much. I will say this, however, I was surprised. I mean, the Liberals won 20 seats in BC, the most since I can remember, right? And only 2 cabinet ministers in British Columbia. I know there will be shuffles in the future. Every parliament has shuffles, and those who weren't picked may be a pick in the future. But I thought that was a surprise for me. I mean, 7 cabinet ministers from Quebec, considering the Liberals won 44 seats in Quebec. That's not a big of a surprise. But I think the surprise for me was British Columbia. How about you, Eric?
Yeah, and maybe not a huge amount of representation out of the West. Now, they only had 1 in Saskatchewan, Buckley Belanger, and he gets in as a Secretary of State, but only 1 from Manitoba as well. And they did pretty well in Winnipeg, so I find it interesting there isn't a Winnipeg minister. They won 2 seats in Alberta. You could have given both of those a seat at the cabinet table instead of just 1. Choices you got to make when you're trying to have a quote-unquote smaller cabinet. Yeah. I mean, with the Secretaries of State, it's still a pretty big cabinet, but... Well, one of the things we talk a lot about, especially when we get closer to an election, when it's a first cabinet, it tends to be more about what this cabinet is supposed to represent, what they're supposed to do, the priorities of the government. When we get closer to elections, we start thinking about the electoral considerations that are put, trying to give higher profile to some ministers. In your view, is a cabinet minister ever worth anything at the local level in terms of results? In your model, do you give the cabinet ministers a bump?
The answer is not a clear yes or no. It's yes usually, but they have to show that they have like an over performance with regards to expectations. Like Mélanie Joly, for instance, in Cartierville in Montreal. When we compare what the Liberals should get or have gotten in the past in that region of Montreal before Mélanie Joly, we see that she has a bonus, right? So I look at precedent. I just don't automatically say, oh, this is a cabinet minister plus 5. That's not how it works. But it's a very small bonus. And you and I, Eric, we talked extensively last fall about several polls, one of which was from Polara, that basically left a blank space for respondents to identify cabinet ministers. And the most identifiable one was Chrystia Freeland, and only a third of respondents could correctly identify her, right? So when we talk about cabinet picks and good choice, right choices, or regional representation, we have to understand how inside baseball this is, because the average voter won't care too much unless it affects them. As I said, I think BC really is underrepresented in this cabinet, but this is only the first version. In a year from now, we could have a shuffle, and then perhaps some MPs from British Columbia will elevate themselves to cabinet. But so this is my not so short answer.
I remember looking a few years ago at the impact of cabinet ministers and whether I wanted to give them a bonus in my model and this kind of thing. And it's been a while now. I haven't updated that with the last few elections, but my conclusion had been that they didn't actually have much of an impact. They weren't actually all that different from a generic incumbent. Because I think, as you said, for most voters, probably with the exception of a few of the higher profile ones that people know, from their cabinet profile, but also from their past profile. You mentioned Mélanie Joly, former candidate for the Montreal mayoralty, and she did pretty well in that election in, what was it, 2013?
2013.
Gregor Robertson in BC, like he also had been a mayor for a while. He's going to have a bit of a higher profile. Stephen Guilbeault, because of his profile in Quebec, is going to have more of a profile. Maybe someone like Evan Solomon, because people have seen him on the TV. But apart from that, most of these people will not have that much more of a bump than any incumbent MP. So I think that's one of the kind of sad realities of these things. Like everybody... I think it was Pierre Trudeau who had said it, and it was quite cruel to say it, but he said he said like something like, I can't remember what the exact term was, but it was something like 200 yards off of Parliament Hill, MPs are nobodies, which is very sad. I don't think that's true. But for our purposes, more often than not, it's actually the case. That brand is still the most important thing.
I do have one question for you, the historian in you, Eric, because I plead ignorance. When I heard about secretaries of state, I was like, the hell is that? When was the last time those words were used? I mean, did Justin Trudeau have secretaries of state? It seems new to me, right? That term, where does this term come from?
We have had secretaries of state before. It sounds very American, but we actually have had it here. I think actually for a long time, the Foreign Affairs Minister was actually called the Secretary of State in Canada, if I'm not mistaken.
Really?
But
okay.
Harper didn't have secretaries of state. He had ministers of state. So we have seen that term used before. But secretaries instead, I don't know, maybe it's to try to maybe when Harper was bringing in the ministers of state, it was to try to elevate those people to sound like they were at the same level as the ministers. Whereas this one, it's almost a way to try to... I don't know what the opposite of elevate is. It would be to push them down so that they can still say that this is supposed to be a smaller, more focused cabinet. And if it means that, the 29 people around the table are the actual decision makers and that the 10 secretaries of state will come in when it's something related to their portfolio, then maybe it is a smaller, more focused cabinet. We'll see how it all works. As you mentioned, this could be the first of many shuffles because Carney's known a lot of these people for... in some cases, a long time. Like there's some people that he knows from before. Yeah. But a lot of these people he's maybe met once when he went to go shake some hands in the riding and things like that. So some of them might not live up to the standards that he is expecting from them. So always fun to see what the first emotions are after a new cabinet. I remember there were some for Justin Trudeau after 2015. So we'll see if there's going to be some here with Mark Carney.
Do we have an update on the by-election in Battle Crow River?
Battle River Crowfoot.
Battle River Crowfoot. I apologize.
I think that the earliest date I've seen is August 5th.
Okay, that's what I saw.
So people understand the process. It isn't Carney dragging his feet. There's a minimum amount of days that you can be an MP before you can actually resign, and then there's an amount of time before that resignation becomes official, and then there's an amount of time before the Prime Minister can set the date, and then the date has to be X amount of days. So that's why it looks like August 5th. If Carney is indeed going to call it as early as he could, that's when it could be. So still be a couple 2.5 months for Pierre Poilievre, who hasn't had to move out of Stornoway.
Yeah.
Andrew Scheer's given him the keys.
I mean, sure, whatever. I mean, if he's gonna stay anyway, why move in to move out and to move?
Well, I don't know if you should presuppose the outcome in Battle River Crowfoot. I mean, it could be close. Who knows?
Well, you're laughing, but hang on, man. Here's one little thing. Will the separatist movement in Alberta will they have a candidate against Poilievre?
It would be interesting.
Because I'm not cheering for or against. I'm just asking if they, because I'm not sure how organized they are, right? I know we had another poll from Léger in Alberta that shows basically the same numbers as the Angus Street Institute had a week prior. About 30%-ish of Albertans, would be open to secede from Canada, even though when you look at the breakdown of very much sure or leading towards, it's about half-half, so maybe it's less than that. But we see in the numbers that it is mostly rural Albertans that are in favor of separation, and Battle River Crowfoot is very much rural. So if they are minimally organized, they would try to have someone against Poilievre and have a seat in Parliament, just like the Bloc Québécois. It's just that I'm not sure they can do it in a short amount of time, or even if they can win. But that would be interesting.
I don't think there's a party that's currently there that could kind of take that role right now. I mean, the Maverick Party, I guess, exists.
No, it's been deregistered, hasn't it?
I'm not sure.
It's gone. Yeah, it's gone.
But Gilles Duceppe, when he won the by-election in 1990, the first time the Bloc won, he was actually an independent. The Bloc hadn't been a registered party yet, right? So they could just run an independent candidate and put it forward as the separatist candidate, and I guess we'll see how that goes.
But they wouldn't win, though. It would be interesting to see what share of the vote they would get. The Conservatives had 80% of the vote. Now they're putting the leader there. I would be baffled if it's even close. But
it's not going to be close.
But it would be interesting.
But if there is one of those candidates and they get 20%, that would be something. That would be.
But if you're an Alberta separatist, there's a risk there, because if you do put a candidate against Poilievre and that candidate gets 7% of the vote, suddenly your movement doesn't seem so strong anymore. So, but it's interesting. We'll follow that up. So.
All right, why don't we move to a poll out of Quebec, which is the next big election happening, with all due respect to Yukon, Newfoundland, Labrador, and I think one of the other territories. Quebec is scheduled to go to the polls next fall.
That's right.
That's one we have circled on our calendar after Newfoundland, Labrador this fall. So we had a new poll out of Quebec, the first one we've seen in a little while. This was from Léger. Why don't you start? Give us the top lines.
Okay, so Parti Québécois, 33%. This is close to the average the PQ has had for the past year and a half. It's between 30 and 35, I think, was the highest. Liberals, Quebec Liberals, 21%. CAQ, François Legault's CAQ at 20%. Now, so we have a statistical tie between the Quebec Liberals and the CAQ. The Conservatives, interestingly, Éric Duhaim's Conservatives at 13%. This is what they had in the election in 2022. They had 12.9% of the vote. And so for all those people who said, oh, this is a one election thing from Éric Duhaim, the Quebec Conservatives, because of the pandemic, because of the safety measures during the pandemic. No, they're hanging on. They're there with 13% of the vote, ahead of Québec Solidaire. We should remind people, Québec Solidaire has 11 seats in the National Assembly, and QS is at 10% in this poll. Among Francophones, the Parti Québécois leads by 19 points. It's 42 PQ, 23 CAQ, Conservatives 13, QS and Liberals 10. And when we look at the regional breakdown, the Liberals do best in Montreal, Greater Montreal. The PQ leads in Quebec City and leads in the regions of Quebec. Before we move on to other stuff in this poll, because it was a pretty interesting poll, what are your thoughts on these numbers, Eric?
Well, you haven't seen much change, which I find is actually pretty interesting considering how much potential influences there were for change, right? U.S. president, federal election. And it's a reminder how in some provinces, in Quebec probably most among them, There is a big difference between that federal and provincial, because you have the PQ doing, 6-7 points better than the Bloc. You have the provincial Liberals doing half as well as Carney did. You have the Conservatives, again, roughly half as good as the federal Conservatives did. So there is a lot of difference between those two voters. It would produce a PQ majority.
Yes, it would.
Which, in the past, we were just talking about a potential referendum in Alberta, would normally mean in a referendum in Quebec. But the numbers we saw for sovereignty in the Quebec poll, not particularly high. What was it, 35?
No, it was 32.
32.
I just lost my tab here, but it was 32% in favor of sovereignty, 59% against, the rest undecided. And even when we look at the regional, not the regional, but the demographic breakdown, it was not good for sovereignty. So there's no big difference in the age groups. It's 35-65 among the young voters. It's 36-64 among older voters. Francophones, 58% against, 42% for. And Montreal, Quebec City, and rest of Quebec are all over 60% against sovereignty. So this is not a good poll. Should not be a surprise. We saw in the federal polls how among the provinces, Quebec was always the highest in the worry with Trump and the tariffs and the relationship between Canada and U.S. And I think swing voters, nationalist voters in Quebec that are swing voters on the referendum question, in this environment, they would tend to vote against. But that doesn't mean anything for the PQ right now. The PQ is still leading. And again, as you said, they would win a majority government with those numbers. It's just that would they really be able to put forth a referendum campaign? That's a tougher one. And not only that, Eric, but just during the campaign next year, if Paul Saint-Pierre Plamondon, the PQ leader, if they still insist adamantly that yes, there will be a referendum on the first mandate of the PQ government, it will change the whole campaign. The campaign will be about this, and in the past, it hasn't not been a winning issue for the PQ.
And it's interesting to put it in the context of the Alberta situation, right? Because we had also that poll from Léger from Alberta. And, it's the same polling firm, not exactly the same question wording, but finding 29% support for Alberta becoming a sovereign country. You have 32% in the Quebec poll. Not a huge difference. But in Quebec, you have a sovereignist party.
Yep.
Able to form a government. In Alberta, you have the UCP, whose a majority of their supporters would support separation, or at least according to one poll that we saw.
Angus Reid,
but not in the same situation where a referendum is going to be held from a position of a mandate. If we do have in Alberta a referendum next year, it'll be because of a petition that was signed by a very small amount of people, rather than a government that was elected, even if it was by a minority. So it's a very different kind of situation. And the fact that there could be an Alberta referendum between now and, I think, the next election, although I think it would be next fall, so maybe it would be almost at the exact same time as a Quebec election. I know that Quebecers don't really think that much about Alberta, but I do wonder how that... Well, that's it. I wonder how that could impact a Quebec provincial election, a Quebec kind of discussion over sovereignty, if at the same time Alberta is discussing leaving Confederation. And who knows what it could be. Maybe if it's a very competitive referendum campaign, maybe that changes the conversation in Quebec too.
It's just that we saw the unveiling of the separation question, with a very direct question. They did the whole show of unveiling. They removed the Alberta flag, and the question was basically, do you want Alberta to be an independent country separate from Canada? Like basically the question that the Supreme Court wanted after the Clarity Act in the late 90s, right? But I was on an Alberta show, Ryan Jesperson, Real Talk with Ryan Jesperson, talking about this. I don't think there are many precedents or many similarities between the Alberta separatist movement and the Quebec one. Even though it's the only precedent we have, so the comparisons are entirely normal and legitimate. But in Quebec, you have a progressive separatist. I want to say separatist because usually it has a negative connotation. I'm careful, but sovereignist. We have right-wing sovereigntists. We have environmentalist sovereigntists. We have sovereigntists in unions, in business, in all spheres of civil society. Right now in Alberta, it's basically just angry conservatives. That poll from the Angus Reid Institute that broke down support for Alberta separation with provincial vote was astonishing. Among NDP voters, it's about 40% of the province, 97% would vote against. That's just, it's as unanimous as you can get. And it was among UCP voters, United Conservatives, Daniel Smith, that the separation movement had its wings. And so if it only comes from one side of the political spectrum, it has very, very little chance to grow and to succeed. And we should not discount as well that this new narrative of Alberta separation being up in the polls and being discussed again comes right after the federal Liberals had their best outing, and not in seats, but in terms of votes in Alberta since before my birth, with 28-something%. So I think it's a reaction to the federal election, and it's hard to see this option having momentum going forward. I don't want to say they're doomed or anything. We don't know. Maybe this is a start. This is a spark to start. But if they have a referendum next year, that's not going to be close.
Well, yeah, probably not. But you never know once you open up these things.
That's true. That's true.
So I don't know. But you mentioned it was there is a lot of grievances behind it that are primarily partisan in nature, right? Because you saw in the Angus Reid poll that we discussed in our last episode that there was a lot of people who said if Pierre Poilievre had won, that they wouldn't be thinking about separation. So there is that kind of element that we don't see in Quebec, right? It doesn't really matter who's in office in Ottawa. Those numbers don't really move. And for that partisan split, you look at what the poll shows in Quebec. You have support for sovereignty among CAQ voters is 24%, 23% among Conservatives, 40% among Quebec Solidaire. Again, it's still remarkable that they're minority. For the PQ is 70%. They're not even as. It's odd to say that the numbers for the PQ on sovereignty are not that dissimilar from the UCP.
I know, right?
And the only party you see where you have unanimity is the Liberals. 95% against, 5% for. But that's historically what it's always been, right? Because they have a lot of support, particularly in this poll. A big chunk of their support is just from Anglophones, right? So it is a very different. There's the similarities is that the two provinces are discussing separation, but beyond that, there's not a lot of similarities, right? It's not based on culture or language identity. It's based more on sort of grievances with the federal government and Alberta's position in Confederation. Yeah. So it'll be a completely different debate if it goes forward, and we'll see what's going to happen on that front. You more on this, or I wanted to discuss the other finding in the poll that is probably worth discussing.
Well, I was just going to say 17% of Alberta voters would want to become a U.S. state. So please, 17% is not negligible. It's 1 in 6, right? But please, it's not a popular option. Even among Albertans who want independence, this is not a popular option. So let's bear that in mind. It's not negligible. It's not 2 or 3%. It's 17, but it's still small. So please,
it's hard to get to 50 from 17.
Oh yeah.
The other aspect from the poll that is worth discussing is the Liberal leadership race, which comes to an end in June next month. For the Quebec Liberals, Pablo Rodriguez seems to be the front runner. He's the front runner in the poll. Yeah. But it's the result of the hypothetical of what would happen with Rodriguez if he became Liberal leader.
So interesting. So this is the same poll and same panel, we should say. If the Quebec Liberals were led by insert candidate, right? Which party would you vote for? And when we put Pablo Rodriguez as a Quebec Liberal leader, the Liberals take the lead, 31%. Statistical tie with the Parti Québécois at 30%. So this means that from the same sample, Pablo Rodriguez pulls the Quebec Liberals up by 10 points. And he pulls those points from all sides. So it's 31 Liberal, 30 PQ, 16 CAQ. Oof, that would hurt at the ballot box. 11 Conservatives and 8% for Québec Solidaire. And the other two contenders were Carl Blackburn and Charles Milliard. They moved the needle a little bit, but nothing as close to what Pablo Rodriguez would do. So this Quebec Liberal leadership race ends on June 14th in Quebec City. I will be there, by the way. And we'll see what happens there, because we could find ourselves, Eric, we could do a podcast sometime in the fall when the National Assembly reopens for the last year of this parliament, of this National Assembly session, and have a statistical tie between the Liberals and the PQ with the CAQ a distant third.
Hey, after what happened earlier this year, new leader can cause quite a bit of change in the polls.
Oh,
and
yeah.
Those hypothetical Mark Carney polls turned out to be pretty darn accurate in the end. Remember how gobsmacked we were? We like, Carney comes in and the NDP drops to 9%?
I know, that's
how
impossible.
Is that possible? Yeah, 9%.
In January,
the NDP would be happy to have 9%.
Yeah, we were so naive and so innocent back in January.
Yeah.
You know?
God, in December when we do our look at how our predictions went for the year, I think we'll blur our faces for it.
We'll skip it. So, but yeah. So okay. So again, when there's a poll on the leadership race, always we have to remember that the population that was polled is not the population that will vote. It's Quebec Liberal members that will vote. But when when the margins are that high, so Léger asked which of these candidates would make the best leader for the Quebec Liberals. If we take the whole sample, 25% says Pablo Rodriguez, 5% says Carl Blackburn, and 5% Charles Milliard. So it's a 5-1. And among Liberal supporters, again, that's 21% of the sample. Pablo Rodriguez goes to 32%. Carl Blackburn 6, and Charles Milliard 4. So we're talking about, again, 5-1 lead for Pablo Rodriguez, which is why, I mean, these results from Léger are not weighted by riding and by age brackets, which, that's how the Quebec Liberal leadership race will work out, by points. But that's still such a big lead that it's hard to see Rodriguez losing this one.
There's going to be a by-election in Quebec at some point this summer in Arthabaska. Is anybody going to step down for Rodriguez to give him a seat? Because they could have that by-election take place at the same time and get the leader in the National Assembly. Curious.
Will a current Liberal MNA step aside for Pablo? I don't see it. They all want to keep their jobs, right? Unless. What would be interesting, though, there is a CAQ seat in Montreal that was won by a former municipal councillor in Anjou, Louis Riel, right? Well, there are municipal elections this fall, so if this lady, her name escapes me, I'm sorry, decides to go back to municipal politics, because with the CAQ is in bad shape right now, that could open up a seat in Anjou Louis Riel, and Quebec Liberals would jump on this. But I'm just speculating here. I really doubt this would happen. And of course, Pablo Rodriguez, let's say he does win the leadership, he's not going to run in Arthabaska. That's just not a good seat for the Liberals. So he's not going to get rid of his new leader aura to in a by-election that he's sure to lose.
How about a quick word on another poll we got from the Liaison out of Ontario? Not too much to say about it, because, I mean, the next Ontario election is 3 years away.
Well, we don't know.
It's supposed to be 4, but maybe it'll be 3. But anyway, the poll has 46% for the Ontario PCs, 36% for the Ontario Liberals, 13% for the NDP, 2% for the Greens. I mean, my takeaway from this poll, which is my main kind of thing I find interesting about it, is that this poll is being done a few weeks after the federal election. And Liaison did a pretty good job of gauging federal support in Ontario to see that the PCs are doing, 5 points better than the federal Conservatives in Ontario. The Ontario Liberals are doing 12 points worse, 12 or 13 points worse. The NDP is
It's doing
Well, I mean,
way
they're
better.
doing 8 points better than the federal NDP, but quite a bit lower than what they had in the last election. We
Yeah.
see that impact, that
Yeah.
federal impact on these numbers. This would still produce a PC majority, but
Oh, yeah.
in this case, finally, I think we could say with some confidence that the NDP would probably not win the official opposition with these kinds of numbers.
I mean, they had what? The Ontario NDP had 18%. Is that correct? And
Yeah.
they barely
18,
hang on to most of those seats, but at 13%. I mean, that NDP brand is taking a hit after the federal election. I would not be surprised to see it recover. That was a bad election for the NDP. But the PCs are still in the driver's seat, unsurprisingly, in Ontario. But it's 3 months after the election, so we'll see. We'll see in the fall.
One just tiny word just on the NDP. I was looking at the results. Take a look at a riding like Oshawa. Okay, the federal NDP I think got 5% or something like that in Oshawa.
Ouch.
And they won Oshawa in the Ontario election just a few months earlier with like 40 plus.
Yeah.
It's just remarkable to see how voters were actually able to switch up their votes very strongly between the federal and the provincial results. And a reminder that the provincial NDP is not the federal NDP.
And the federal NDP could learn a thing or two from the Ontario NDP, let's be fair. So, yeah.
Oh, yeah. Do you have a quiz, or are we moving to number of the week?
I do not have a quiz
Okay.
this week. I figured I would skip a week, but the quiz will be back very soon. Thing is, I want you to forget a little bit about the 2025 election so I can quiz you on this, because that last quiz that you crushed, right? So
Yeah,
I'm counting on your memory to fade a little bit. So.
Okay. How about, do you got a number of the week?
I think I said it already. That was at 17% of voters in Alberta that would like to join the United States. Again, I know I said it a minute ago, but this was my number of the week. I expect it to be higher with everything that we read on social media, and we know that the Republican supporters, let's just say, in Alberta are very
Quite
loud.
literally, because they started a party called the Alberta Republicans.
Yeah, that'll be interesting to see in the next provincial election if they do better than 1%. I sometimes somehow doubt it, but so those supporters, they tend to be loud and they are present in social media. It's not that many of them, so let's not overreact.
I'll stick also to Alberta. There's been a lot of discussion about Danielle Smith and whether the approach he is taking is popular among Albertans. And so my number will be 53%. That's the amount of Albertans who agree with Danielle Smith's approach to the demand she made on the federal government. Only 34% of Albertans disagreed. And you can keep looking on a number of these questions. 46% agreed with Premier Smith's trips to the United States.
Yeah.
You have 45% agreeing on. This is a different question here, but 44%. No, I'm falling apart. But you do see that the approach that Danielle Smith has taken over the last little while with the United States, with the federal government, does not seem to have hurt her. No. We haven't seen a voting intentions poll in Alberta for a little while. But when you look at these kinds of numbers, it doesn't suggest that she has taken a hit from this. We'll see. I'd like to see with some of these questions on separation whether that has had much of an impact. But we do see that she still does have pretty good grip on the province in terms of the position she's taking. So that's something to take into account. While it's clear from the polling that a vast majority, or at least a big majority of Albertans don't want to separate and don't really probably want to go down this path. Yeah. There is still a big chunk of voters who are on board with what Danielle Smith is doing with other things related to those relations with Ottawa.
Alberta keeps being interesting. I love it. I mean,
it is.
It was a dynasty for so long that in the past decade, Alberta politics has been interesting. I appreciate that at least. So
yeah. All right, so that'll be it for this week's episode of The Numbers. If you'd like to join our Patreon, it's at thenumberspod.ca. On the past weekend, we had an episode where we did our NDP leadership draft.
That's right.
And I think Philippe is laughing because he did so poorly. His picks are really not very good. But if you want to listen to that, you can go to thenumberspod.ca. You also get ad-free episodes, so you can join us at thenumberspod.ca. And Philippe will chat in another week. and looking forward to what surprises will be in store for us in the numbers over the next 7 days.
Absolutely. Merci beaucoup, Eric. Merci beaucoup, tout le monde. Have a great week.